Hello hunters, I am Mr. Nissen. For many of you, I am your physical science teacher. I'll be going through our first lab activity, the first part of it here with you right now. So you've got a sheet that shows you different pieces of lab equipment. I'm going to go over the first 7 of those and then hand it off to one of the other physical science teachers here at Denfeld. So letter A. All right. We'll go through these pieces of equipment one at a time. This is letter A. It's a beaker. A lot of times you might see it in a setup like we have here. I'll be going through these pieces as we go. Again, letter A, beaker. You might see different sizes of beakers. Here's a much larger beaker. It's got 100 milliliters, goes up to a 1,000 milliliters, sorry. And this one only goes up to 150. So they're different sizes for different purposes. Letter B is called a watch glass. What we use a watch glass for is, let's say we're boiling some water in our smaller beaker here and we want to prevent it from spilling over. We just put that watch glass over it so that that boiling water doesn't get on us or the lab around us. Letter C is the wire gauze, and that's what we put on the iron ring, which is letter D. So here we've got letter D, iron ring. Letter C is the wire gauze, and that would go on top of that iron ring. We put the beaker on there so that it holds it up during heating. All right, letter E is a funnel. You usually use a funnel to pour liquids from a larger container into a smaller container. This is letter F here, test tube. So you might use this funnel to pour something from, say, this graduated cylinder here into that test tube. So E, funnel, F, test tube. If you want to move smaller amounts of liquids at a time, you might use letter G, which is an eyedropper. If you're not being exact, these work very well. If you want to measure out a very small amount of liquid and then transfer it between containers, you would use a pipette. They have small graduations on there that allow you to measure exactly a small amount. You might see another type of pipette. This one's a little fatter. It goes up to 3 milliliters. Some of the much smaller, thinner ones only go up to 1 milliliter. So that again is G, eyedropper, H, pipette.
Hello everyone, I am Mr. Bruns. I am the other 9th grade physical science teacher that will be teaching you this year. I'm going to run through the next 7 items that you are going to be using or may be using in lab to conduct labs this year. So what I'm going to do now is I is tongs, and I have 3 different types of tongs. There are multiple types of tongs to use. Some tongs, like this one, is better to pick up beakers. If you are warming them up, you do not want to burn your hands. You do not know glass is hot, so we use tongs to pick them up. This set of tongs right here is good for Erlenmeyer flasks. So say over here to grab an Erlenmeyer flask, that is a great tong to use. And then we just have a general tong that you can use as well. All right, then moving on to J. J is a thermometer, and I know a lot of you know what thermometers are, but they are to take temperature of different liquids and different substances, and so primarily use them in a beaker. And as you can see, my beaker here is a little too small to hold my thermometer, so sometimes you will use larger beakers and you put your thermometer in to get the temperature of your liquid or substance that you need to take a temperature of. All right, let's see, moving on to K. K is our graduated cylinder, and we use these all the time. All right, this gives you an exact amount of liquid that you need to use in an experiment. So an example, I need 51 milliliters of water, and I'm going to pour that into my test tube. All right, so I measure out 51 milliliters of water in my graduated cylinder. I take my test tube and I'm able to pour the exact amount of liquid into my test tube. Very important. Then L. L is our ring stand, and our ring stand is very useful. All right, as you can see, our setup here is very useful to running our experiments. All right, it holds many different things to allow us not to touch hot things and things like that. Then moving on to M. M is our Bunsen burner, and yes, these are so much fun because it is fire. All right, so we do not blow anything up, but it is really fun to play with fire sometimes. All right, so and we are also very careful when we use the Bunsen burners. And so they sit on your ring stand. They allow you to heat different substances. All right, so we can see some chemical reactions. All right, and some fun science experiments. All right, moving on to N. N is very important as well. This is a test tube holder. All right, it allows us to pick up and hold a test tube. All right, so if we need to heat it in a liquid or if we need to heat it over the Bunsen burner, it allows us, all right, to hold it and keep our fingers safe out of the heat, and also allows us to pick it up in an easy manner. All right, so N is the test tube holder. Lastly, O is a test tube clamp, or just a clamp. All right, and the clamp is used on our ring stand. All right, this allows us, all right, to hold things. Say I am boiling water and I need to heat up my test tube and I want to heat it up nicely and not over an open flame. I'm able to put my clamp on my ring stand. I have my test tube boiling in water. All right, so it's a nice constant temperature and it's not getting direct heat. All right, thank you.
Hi, I'm Miss Griffin, Jenna Griffin. I teach the least amount of physical science between the three of us. I only have one class, so I'll probably see the smallest out of all of you. But I'm the chemistry teacher at Denfeld, so you'll have me in a couple years. I'm going to finish out today with the last 7. So we're going to start at letter P, where we left off. Letter P is a container. It's a plastic, almost looks like a water bottle, and we use it to rinse out any extra sediment that we might need to get out of a beaker, an Erlenmeyer flask, a test tube. So often we can just fill it up by squirting into a test tube like that. Okay? All right, so just to reiterate, P was your water bottle. Then we're moving on to Q. Q is arguably the most important feature of our lab setup. That is your goggles. They are expected to be worn anytime you're in the lab for any reason. There might be small exceptions, so make sure that you're asking your teacher, but generally speaking, goggles are a must, okay? Obviously now I have to wear them. All right, letter R. I've kind of already used it, but it's really good for holding mainly our test tubes. It's called a test tube rack. The reason why it's so great is that test tubes have a rounded bottom, so you can't just easily set them on the table without them falling and breaking. So we use a test tube rack, letter R, test tube rack. Another thing that they're good for is oftentimes we're not just using one test tube, we're using multiple. So it's a great way to help organize the test tubes in a specific place. All right, that brings us to letter S. Letter S is very similar to a beaker. It's called an Erlenmeyer flask. The main feature that you'll notice is it kind of comes to a smaller point at the top, and then it gets much thinner. And the reason why we might use an Erlenmeyer flask versus a beaker is if we need to swirl anything. If we swirl something, we use an Erlenmeyer flask because it has a more narrow opening, and so less splash is going to happen. So that's the main difference. Then it brings us to this setup over here. So I'm going to just rearrange for a moment. All right, that brings us to this setup. Letter T is called an evaporating dish. Oftentimes we use this when we want to separate a solid from water. We would set this test tube or this evaporating dish on a hot plate. We could put it over a Bunsen burner, but for now we have it over a hot plate, and it evaporates all the liquid, generally water, out. Letter U is what it is sitting on. This is a hot plate. Hot plates are great because they provide a more consistent temperature. Bunsen burners can kind of be sporadic in their temperature, especially if you're moving a beaker around, picking it up and putting it back on. So that temperature change can be a little difficult with some labs. So on labs where we want a very, very steady and consistent temperature, we would use the hot plate. And the last one, letter V, Comes in different forms. We have just the one to show you today. It's called the scupula, and that's used for getting out solid chunks when maybe they're hot and we just need to dispose of them, or it's good for scooping chemicals out of a storage container. So if I say, hey, you need to get 10 grams of sugar, we could just use this scoop, and you'd go measure out your 10 grams of sugar using a scupula, letter V. All right, thanks.